The savannah burned under the weight of a dying sun, its golden light bleeding into the horizon. Dust hung in the air, stirred by the faint breeze that carried the scent of dry grass and something heavier, something final. Beneath a lone acacia tree, its branches clawing at the sky, lay Mwindaji, a lion whose once mighty frame was now a shadow of itself. His tawny fur was matted with blood, his flanks heaved with shallow breaths, and his amber eyes flickered with the last embers of life. Each labored gasp sent a pang through Tembo's chest, though he didn't know why. Tembo, a young elephant barely past his 10th year, stood at the edge of his herd, his ears twitching nervously. The herd's massive forms loomed around him, their trunks swaying like pendulums, their eyes fixed on the lion. Tembo's heart thudded, a mix of fear and fascination. Lions were danger, the stuff of his mother's warnings, yet this one looked broken, not fierce. He glanced at Kipepeo, the herd's matriarch, her wrinkled face unreadable as she stared at Mwindaji. Her tusks gleamed in the fading light, and her stillness made Tembo's skin prickle. Why weren't they moving on? "Stay back, Tembo," his mother, Nia, rumbled softly, her trunk brushing his shoulder. Her voice was warm but firm, her eyes darting between her son and the lion. Tembo shifted his weight, his broad feet sinking into the cracked earth. He wanted to obey, but his gaze kept pulling back to Mwindaji. The lion's ribs jutted sharply and a gash across his side oozed darkly. Tembo's throat tightened. He'd seen death before, a calf trampled by a buffalo, a zebra caught by hyenas. But this felt different. This felt personal. Kipepeo took a slow step forward, her massive body casting a shadow over the grass. The herd tensed, a low rumble passing through them like a storm cloud. "Kipepeo, no," an elder cow muttered, her voice thick with worry. "He's a lion, let him be." But Kipepeo didn't falter. Her trunk curled upward, tasting the air, and her eyes held a quiet fire Tembo had never seen. She wasn't afraid. She was something else, determined, tender even. Tembo's breath caught as Kipepeo spoke, her voice deep and steady, cutting through the herd's murmurs. "We stay." The words landed like stones, heavy and unyielding. Tembo blinked, his ears flapping in confusion. Stay. Near a lion, he looked at Mwindaji, whose head lifted slightly, a faint growl escaping his throat. It wasn't menacing, though. It was weak, almost a plea. Tembo's chest ached again, sharper this time. He didn't understand Kipepeo's choice, but he felt its weight, like the earth itself was holding its breath. The herd shifted uneasily, their massive bodies swaying. Nia's trunk tightened around Tembo's, pulling him closer. "She's lost her mind," Nia whispered, her voice trembling with something between anger and fear. Tembo didn't answer. He couldn't. His eyes were locked on Kipepeo, who stood, tall, her gaze never leaving Mwindaji. The lion's eyes met hers, and for a moment the savannah seemed to still. No wind, no distant calls, just the two of them, bound by something Tembo couldn't name. He took a step forward, ignoring Nia's. Sharp intake of breath. His heart raced, but he needed to see, to understand. Mwindaji's flank shuddered, and a low, pained whine escaped him. Tembo's ears flared, his trunk twitching as he caught the scent of blood and dust. He was close enough now to see the lions. Scars, the stories etched into his hide. This wasn't just a predator. This was a life, slipping away. Kipepeo turned her head slightly, her eyes finding Tembo's. There was no anger in them, only a quiet challenge, as if she saw something in him he didn't yet know. "Kindness is not weakness," she said softly. Her words meant for him alone. Tembo swallowed, his mind spinning. Kindness? For a lion? The idea was absurd, dangerous, yet it stirred something deep inside him. Something that made him want to stay, too. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and shadow, Tembo stood rooted to the spot, torn between fear and a growing, unshakable need to act. The savannah waited, and so Did Mwendaji, his fate hanging in the balance of an elephant's impossible choice. The savannah exhaled into the night, its heat replaced by a cool, silver sheen of moonlight. Stars blinked through the acacia's sparse canopy, casting dappled shadows over Mwendaji's still form. The lion's breaths came slower now, each one a faint rasp that seemed to pull at Tembo's heart. He stood at the herd's edge, his eyes locked on the dying beast, unable to look away. The herd's low rumbles filled the air, a chorus of unease that matched the knot in Tembo's stomach. Why were they still here? Kipipeo stood closest to Mwendaji, her massive silhouette unwavering against the moonlit grass. The herd circled, loosely, their trunks swaying, their feet shifting in the dirt. Tembo's mother, Nia, pressed close to him, her warmth a comfort but her silence heavy with worry. The others weren't so quiet. "This is madness," grumbled Zawadi, an elder cow with a notched ear. "He's a lion, Kipipeo. His pride will come. We're risking everything." Her voice was sharp, slicing through the night, and a few others murmured agreement. Tembo's ears twitched, catching every word. He glanced at Kipipeo, waiting for her to snap back, to assert her authority as matriarch, but she didn't. Instead, she lowered her trunk, brushing it gently over the grass near Mwendaji's head. The lion didn't stir, but his eyes flickered open, glinting in the moonlight. Tembo's breath hitched. There was no threat in those eyes, only exhaustion, a quiet surrender. Kipipeo's voice, when it came, was soft but firm, like the earth itself speaking. "We owe him." The herd fell silent, the words hanging in the air. Tembo's mind raced. Owe him? A lion? He looked at Nia, hoping for an explanation, but her eyes were fixed on Kipipeo, wide with disbelief. Zawadi snorted, stamping a foot. "Owe him what? Our lives? Our calves?" Her challenge sparked more murmurs, the herd's tension coiling. Tighter. Tembo felt it too, a tug between fear and the strange pull of Kipipeo's words. He took a step closer, ignoring Nia's low rumble of warning. Kipipeo raised her head, her tusks catching the moonlight like twin crescents. "Years ago," she began, her voice steady, "when I was young and my first calf was barely weaned, a lion attacked our herd." Tembo's ears flared, his heart pounding. He'd heard stories of lion attacks, but Kipipeo's tone held something new, something heavy with memory. "It was Mwendaji," she continued, nodding toward the lion. "He was young, too, all hunger and fire. He chased my calf, pinned her to the ground." Her voice cracked, and Tembo's chest tightened, imagining the terror. But he stopped. Kipipeo said. "He looked at her, at me, and he let her go. He walked away, left us in peace." The herd was silent now, even Zawadi's grumbling stilled. Tembo stared at Mwendaji, trying to see the fierce young lion in the broken body before him. "Why?" he whispered, the question slipping out before he could stop it. Kipipeo's eyes met his, warm and sad. "I don't know, but I never forgot." The story settled over Tembo like dust, heavy and impossible to shake. He looked at Mwendaji, whose flank barely rose with each breath. A lion who spared a calf? It didn't fit the warnings Nia had drilled into him. Lions were hunters, killers, not creatures of mercy. Yet Kipipeo's certainty burned brighter than his doubt, and it stirred something in him, a flicker of awe. Was this why they stayed? To repay a debt from years ago? Zawadi broke the silence, her voice softer now but still edged with fear. "And if his pride comes, what then?" Kipipeo didn't answer right away. She turned back to Mwendaji, her trunk hovering over his wounds, as if she could will him to live. "Then we face them," she said finally. "But we don't abandon him now." Tembo's heart thudded, torn between Kipipeo's resolve and the herd's fear. Nia's trunk curled around his, pulling him back, but he resisted, his eyes on Mwendaji. The lion's head shifted, a low groan escaping him, and Tembo felt a surge of urgency. Whatever Kipipeo planned, it was dangerous, maybe foolish, but it felt right. As the moon climbed higher, Tembo stood rooted, caught in the pull of a kindness he didn't yet understand, wondering what it would cost them all. Dawn crept over the savannah, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds. The air was crisp, carrying the faint musk of dew-soaked grass and the sharp tang of Mwindaji's wounds. The lion lay motionless under the acacia, his chest rising and falling so faintly Tembo had to squint to be sure he was still alive. The herd stood in a loose semicircle, their silhouettes stark against the brightening horizon. Tembo's legs ached from standing all night, but his heart raced, fueled by Kipapeo's story and the lion's quiet struggle. Kipapeo hadn't moved, her eyes fixed on Mwindaji like a mother watching a sick calf. The herd's murmurs had faded, replaced by an uneasy silence, broken only by the distant call of a francolin. Tembo glanced at his mother, Nia, whose trunk rested protectively on his back. Her eyes were heavy with worry, her body tense as if ready to bolt. "We should go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This isn't our fight." Tembo's ears twitched, but he didn't answer. His gaze kept pulling back to Mwindaji, to the way the lion's tongue lolled, cracked, and dry in the morning light. Kipapeo's words from the night before echoed in Tembo's mind. "We owe him." He didn't fully understand, but the weight of her conviction stirred something in him, a need to do more than watch. He shifted his weight, his broad feet crunching the dry grass. Nia's trunk tightened, a silent warning, but Tembo's heart thudded with a reckless urge. He couldn't just stand there, not when Mwindaji's life was slipping away like sand through his trunk. "Tembo, no," Nia hissed as he took a step forward, his shadow falling over the lion. The herd's eyes snapped to him, a ripple of alarm passing through them. Zawadi snorted, her notched ear flicking. "Foolish calf," she muttered. Tembo ignored her, his focus narrowing to Mwindaji. Up close, the lion's wounds were worse, deep, gashes crusted with blood, flies buzzing around them. His fur was dull, his eyes half closed, but they flickered toward Tembo, glinting with a faint spark of awareness. Tembo's breath caught. He'd never been this close to a lion, never felt the weight of those eyes. Fear prickled his skin, but so did something else, pity, sharp and urgent. Mwindaji's lips were parched, his tongue barely moving. Tembo's trunk twitched, remembering the cool water they'd passed at the stream yesterday. Without thinking, he turned, ignoring Nia's sharp rumble, and lumbered to a nearby puddle, the herd's gasps trailing him like a breeze. He sucked water into his trunk, the cold liquid sloshing inside, and hurried back. The herd watched, frozen, as Tembo stood over Mwindaji. His heart pounded. Would the lion lash out? Could he even move? Tembo hesitated, then sprayed the water gently, aiming for Mwindaji's face. The droplets hit the lion's muzzle, sparkling in the dawn light. Mwindaji flinched, a low groan escaping him, but he didn't strike. Instead, his tongue darted out, lapping weakly at the moisture. The herd erupted in low rumbles, some of fear, some of awe. Nia surged forward, her trunk yanking Tembo back. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice trembling. Tembo met her eyes, his own wide but steady. "He's thirsty," he said simply, the words feeling bigger than he meant. Nia's ears flared, but she didn't argue, her gaze darting to Mwindaji, who lay still, his breathing a touch steadier. Kipapeo's trunk brushed Tembo's shoulder, her touch warm and heavy. "Well done," she murmured, her voice thick with pride. Tembo's chest swelled, but fear gnawed at him too. What if the pride came now? What if his act had doomed them? He looked at Mwindaji, whose eyes were open wider, watching him with something like gratitude. The sight sent a shiver through Tembo, a mix of wonder and dread. The savannah seemed to hold its breath, the morning light softening Mwindaji's scars. Tembo stood rooted, caught between the herd's fear and the fragile hope he'd sparked. He'd taken a step, small but bold, and now there was no going back. As the savannah pulsed with mid-morning heat, the sun climbing high, baking the earth, until it cracked. Tembo stood near Mwindaji, the lion's faint breaths a steady rhythm against the hum of cicadas. The herd lingered in a ragged circle, their massive bodies casting long shadows over the grass. Tembo's trunk still tingled. From the water he'd sprayed, his heart caught between pride and the weight of the herd's stares. And Mwindaji's eyes, clearer now, followed him, and Tembo felt a strange warmth, like a thread tying them together. But the herd was unraveling. Nia paced behind Tembo, her ears flapping, her trunk curling tight around his whenever he moved too, close to the lion. "Enough, Tembo," she muttered, her voice low but sharp like a thorn. "You've done enough." Her eyes darted to Mwindaji, then to the horizon, where dust stirred faintly. Hyenas, maybe, or worse, the pride. Tembo wanted to argue, to explain the pull he felt, but her fear held him silent. Kipepeo stood firm, her tusks glinting as she faced the herd. "We stay," she said again, her voice a deep rumble that silenced the murmurs. Zawadi snorted, stamping, her foot sending a puff of dust into the air. "Stay? For what? To die with him?" She gestured her trunk toward Mwindaji, her notched ear twitching with anger. "Tembo's foolishness will bring the pride down on us. We have calves to protect." A few cows rumbled agreement, their eyes flicking to their young, huddled close. Tembo's stomach twisted. He glanced at Mwindaji, whose head rested on the grass, too weak to react. Had he been foolish? He looked to Kipepeo, hoping for reassurance, but her face was set, her eyes burning with a quiet fire. "Listen," she said, stepping forward, her massive frame commanding attention. "Mwindaji is no ordinary lion. Years ago, when poachers came with their traps and guns, they poisoned our watering hole. We would have died, all of us, if Mwindaji hadn't fought them off." The herd stilled, even Zawadi's grumbling fading. Tembo's ears flared, his mind painting the scene. Mwindaji, roaring, charging, risking his life for their water. "He drove them away," Kipepeo continued, her voice softening. "He lost a brother that day, but he saved us. This herd, our calves, our future." She paused, her trunk brushing the air near Mwindaji. "We cannot turn our backs now." Tembo's chest ached, a mix of awe and guilt. He hadn't known, hadn't understood the depth of Mwindaji's sacrifice. He glanced at Nia, hoping she'd soften, but her eyes were hard, her trunk pulling him closer. "That was then," she said loud enough for all to hear. "He's dying now, Kipepeo. We can't save him, and staying risks everything. My son." Her voice broke, and Tembo felt her tremble. "I won't lose him to this. The herds." Rumbles grew louder, splitting into two currents, those swayed by Kipepeo's story and those clinging to Nia's fear. Tembo stood between them, his heart torn. He loved his mother, her warmth, her fierce protection, but Kipepeo's words lit something in him, a need to be more than safe, to be brave. He looked at Mwindaji, whose flank shuddered with a weak cough, and felt that thread again, pulling him toward action. "Tembo," Nia said, her voice softer now, pleading. "Come with me, please." Her eyes searched his, full of love and terror. Tembo's throat tightened. He wanted to ease her fear, to be the son she needed, but he couldn't shake Kipepeo's story or the memory of Mwindaji's eyes after the water. "I'm sorry," he whispered, stepping toward Kipepeo. Nia's trunk fell away, and the silence that followed was heavier than the heat. Kipepeo nodded at Tembo, a flicker of pride in her eyes, but the herd's divide deepened. Zawadi turned, leading a few cows away, their calves trailing. Others stayed, their trunks raised in defiance. Tembo stood by Kipepeo, his heart pounding as the dust settled. The savannah watched, its silence thick with the promise of danger. Mwindaji's life hung by a thread, and Tembo's choice had split the herd, leaving him to wonder if kindness could hold them together, or tear them apart. Noon scorched the savannah, the sun a merciless eye glaring down on the cracked earth. Tembo stood near Mwindaji, the lion's shallow breaths barely audible over the drone of flies. The herd, now split, felt smaller, more exposed. Kipapeo's loyal cows formed a tight circle around the acacia, their trunks swaying nervously, while Zawadi's group lingered at a distance, their silhouettes hazy in the heat. Tembo's heart thudded, heavy with Nia's absence. She'd joined. Zawadi, her eyes wet with betrayal as she'd turned away. He wanted to run to her, but Mwindaji's faint wheeze held him in place. The air shifted, carrying a sour, musky scent that made Tembo's ears flare. Hyenas, their cackling laughter, echoed from the brush, sharp and hungry, slicing through the savannah's hum. Tembo's skin prickled as dark shapes slunk into view, their eyes glinting like wet stones. 5 of them, maybe 6, their spotted hides taut over lean frames. They circled wide, testing, their gazes locked on Mwindaji's prone form. Tembo's stomach churned. They smelled death, and they wanted it. Kipepeo stepped forward, her massive body a wall between the lion and the hyenas. "Stay close," she rumbled, her voice steady but laced with warning. The herd tightened around Mwindaji, their calves tucked behind trembling legs. Tembo pressed against Kipepeo, his trunk twitching, his eyes darting between the hyenas and Mwindaji. The lion's head lifted slightly, a low growl rumbling in his throat, but it was weak, more plea than threat. Tembo's chest tightened. He'd given water, taken a stand, but now what? Could they really protect him? The hyenas grew bolder, their laughter rising as they darted closer, snapping at the air. One, larger than the rest, lunged toward Mwindaji, its jaws wide. Tembo's fear exploded into action. He trumpeted, a raw, piercing sound that tore from his throat, startling the hyena mid-stride. It skidded back, ears flat, but its eyes narrowed, now fixed on Tembo. The herd froze, their rumbles of alarm vibrating through the ground. Kipapeo's trunk brushed Tembo's flank, a silent caution, but he stood tall, his heart pounding with reckless courage. "You've drawn their attention," Kipapeo said softly, her voice calm but urgent. She stepped forward, her tusks lowered, her massive frame casting a shadow over the hyenas. The pack hesitated, their cackles faltering, but they didn't retreat. Tembo's breath hitched. He'd meant to protect Mwindaji, not make things worse. His eyes flicked to Zawadi's group, hoping for help, but they stood frozen, Nia's form rigid among them. She wouldn't come, not now. Kipapeo moved again, her trunk swinging like a whip as she charged a few steps, her feet shaking the earth. The hyenas scattered, yelping, but they regrouped quickly, their eyes gleaming with defiance. Tembo's heart sank. They weren't leaving. Kipapeo's age showed in her heavy breaths, her movements slower than he'd expected. She was risking everything, and so was the herd, for Mwindaji, for kindness. Tembo's gaze fell on Mwindaji, whose eyes met his, bright with something like trust. It steadied him, fueled him. He trumpeted again, softer this time, joining Kipapeo as she stamped and swung her trunk. The herd followed, their rumbles rising, into a chorus, their bodies a united front. The hyenas paced, their laughter quieter now, their confidence shaken by the herd's resolve. Finally, the largest hyena turned, slinking into the brush, the others trailing behind, their eyes still hungry but wary. The savannah exhaled, the tension easing like a held breath released. Tembo's legs trembled, but pride surged through him. They'd done it. Protected Mwindaji, if only for now. Kipapeo's trunk rested on his shoulder, heavy with approval. "You're learning," she murmured, her voice warm. Tembo nodded, but his eyes drifted to Nia, still distant, her face unreadable. The hyenas would return, he knew, and the pride might too. Their kindness had won this moment. But at a cost. Nia's trust, the herd's unity, and a growing danger Tembo could feel in his bones. As the sun burned overhead, he stood by Mwindaji, wondering how much more their compassion could bear. The savannah sighed into late afternoon, the sun dipping low, casting long soft shadows across the grass. The hyenas' cackles had faded. Their retreat, leaving a fragile calm. Tembo stood near Mwindaji, his trunk still trembling from the confrontation. The lion's breaths were steadier now, his eyes half open, glinting with a faint spark of life. The herd, though weary, held their ground around the acacia, their rumbles quieter, their calves nudging closer to their mothers. Tembo's heart still raced, but the danger's pause let something new settle in. Hope. Kipepeo rested nearby, her massive frame slumped slightly, her age showing in the slow sway of her trunk. Tembo glanced at her, then at Zawadi's group in the distance where Nia stood, her back to him. The divide stung, but Mwindaji's survival felt like a small victory, one Tembo clung to. He looked at the lion, noticing the dry crust around. His muzzle, the way his tongue barely moved. The puddle he'd used earlier was gone, soaked into the earth, but Tembo's trunk twitched with memory. There was a stream, not far, where the herd had drunk yesterday. He moved before doubt could stop him, lumbering toward the stream, his ears catching the herd's soft rumbles of surprise. Kipepeo's eyes followed him, but she didn't call him back. The stream glittered under the afternoon light, its water cool and clear. Tembo filled his trunk, the liquid heavy and soothing, and hurried back, his steps careful to avoid spilling. The herd watched, their tension easing into curiosity as he stood over Mwindaji. Tembo hesitated, his trunk hovering. The lion's eyes met his, no longer clouded, but sharp, watching. Tembo's heart thudded. Would Mwindaji lash out? But the lion only blinked, slow and deliberate, as if waiting. Tembo sprayed the water gently, letting it trickle over Mwindaji's face, washing away dust and blood. The lion flinched, then lapped at the droplets, his tongue moving with more strength. A low, grateful rumble escaped him. So soft, Tembo felt it more than heard it. The herd fell silent, their eyes wide. Tembo's chest swelled, a warmth spreading through him like sunlight. He'd done this, given Mwindaji a moment of relief, maybe more. He stepped back and Kipepeo moved forward, her trunk curling with a tenderness Tembo hadn't seen before. She reached out, her trunk brushing Mwindaji's flank, light as a whisper. The lion didn't tense or growl. He sighed, his body relaxing under her touch. Tembo's breath caught. It was trust, raw and impossible between predator and prey. Kipepeo's eyes met Tembo's, her gaze warm with pride. "You see," she murmured, "kindness builds bridges." Tembo nodded, his throat tight. He looked at Mwindaji, whose eyes held his again, not with the wariness of a hunter but with something deeper, gratitude, maybe even understanding. Tembo felt that thread between them tighten, a bond forged in water and courage. He glanced at the herd, their faces softer now, some trunks reaching out to touch each other, as if Mwindaji's survival was knitting them back together. In the distance, Zawadi's group shifted, their silhouettes less rigid. Tembo's heart leapt. Nia was watching, her ears flared, her trunk raised slightly. She didn't come closer, but her gaze wasn't angry anymore, just searching. Tembo wanted to run to her, to explain the warmth in his chest, but he stayed, rooted by Mwindaji's side. This moment, fragile and fleeting, was bigger than his fear, bigger than the divide. The savannah seemed to glow, the afternoon light bathing Mwindaji's scars, making them less harsh. Tembo stood tall, his trunk curling with quiet resolve. He'd acted, and Mwindaji had responded, not with teeth, but with trust. Kipepeo's trunk rested on his shoulder, a steady anchor. The herd's rumbles grew softer, almost tender, as if they too felt the shift. But Tembo knew the hyenas lurked, and the pride might come. This connection, this bridge was a miracle, but it was fragile and the savannah never stayed still. As the light faded, Tembo watched Mwindaji breathe, wondering how long their kindness could hold against the wild. The savannah darkened as evening settled, heavy clouds rolling in, their edges bruised with the promise of rain. The air grew thick, electric, pressing against Tembo's skin as he stood near Mwindaji. The lions. Breaths were steady now, his eyes half closed, lulled by the water and Kipipeo's gentle touch. The herd's tension had eased, their rumbles soft, almost reverent as they watched the unlikely bond unfold. But Tembo's heart was heavy, his eyes drawn to the distant silhouettes of Zawadi's group, where Nia stood, her back rigid, her trunk curled tight. He'd seen her watching earlier, her gaze softening as he'd given Mwindaji water, but she hadn't come closer. The space between them felt like a chasm, wider than the savannah itself. Tembo's trunk twitched, longing to feel her warmth, her familiar nudge, but fear held him back. What if she turned away again? Kipipeo's voice, low and steady, broke his thoughts. "Go to her," she said, her eyes kind but firm. "She needs you, even if she doesn't say it." Tembo hesitated, glancing at Mwindaji, then at Kipipeo. The matriarch nodded, her trunk brushing his flank. He took a step, then another, his heart pounding as he crossed the grass toward Nia. The herds. Eyes followed, their rumbles fading into the hum of distant thunder. Zawadi's group tensed as he approached, their trunks raised, but Nia stepped forward, her ears flapping, her eyes glistening in the dim light. "Tembo," she said, her voice thick, a mix of relief and something sharper. He stopped a trunk's length away, his ears low, his throat tight. "Mother," he started, but the word felt small, not enough to bridge the gap. Nia's trunk reached out, then pulled back as if afraid to touch him. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why risk everything for a lion?" Her eyes searched his, raw with pain, and Tembo's chest ached. He wanted to explain, the thread he felt with Mwindaji, the pull of Kipipeo's stories, but Nia's hurt silenced him. She turned slightly, her gaze drifting to the horizon. "You don't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You were too young to remember." Tembo's ears flared, sensing the weight of her words. "Your sister," Nia continued, her trunk trembling. "My first calf. A lion. Took her. Not Mwindaji, but one like him. I heard her scream, felt the ground shake as she fell. I couldn't save her." Her voice cracked and Tembo's heart twisted, picturing a calf he'd never known. A loss Nia carried in every step. "I see that lion in Mwindaji," Nia said, her eyes meeting his again, wet and fierce. "And I see you, so close to him, and I'm terrified, Tembo. I can't lose you, too." Her trunk finally reached out, wrapping around his, tight and desperate. Tembo leaned into her, his own eyes stinging. He hadn't known, hadn't understood, the depth of her fear. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice thick. "I didn't mean to hurt you." Nia's grip softened, but her eyes held his, searching. "Then why do it?" she asked. Tembo swallowed, struggling for words. "Because Kipipeo says kindness matters, and when Daji spared her calf, saved our water. I feel it, Mother. He's not just a lion, he's like us." The words felt clumsy, but they were true, spilling from the warmth in his chest. Nia's ears twitched, her face softening, though pain lingered. "I'll be careful," Tembo added, his voice steadier. "I promise." Nia's trunk tightened again, a silent plea, but she nodded, a small surrender. Thunder rumbled closer, the air heavy with the storm's approach. Tembo felt her love, her fear, and the fragile trust they'd rebuilt. He glanced back at Mwindaji, Kipipeo's form steady beside him, and knew he couldn't abandon them. Not now. As they stood together, the first raindrops fell cool and sharp. Nia didn't join Kipipeo's group, but she didn't pull Tembo away either. The savannah waited, its silence charged with the storm and the weight of their choices. Tembo's heart swelled with love for Nia, but the thread to Mwindaji held, fast, pulling him back toward the lion, toward kindness, even as the sky promised chaos. Night cloaked the savannah, the storm breaking open the sky with a roar. Rain lashed down in sheets, turning the earth to mud, the acacia's branches thrashing in the wind. Lightning cracked, illuminating Mwindaji's frail form, his fur plastered to his bones. Tembo stood close, his legs sinking into the slick ground, his trunk curled tight against the cold. The herd huddled around the lion, their massive bodies a trembling shield against the tempest. Kipepeo's voice, barely audible over the howling wind, urged them closer, her tusks gleaming in the flashes of light. Tembo's heart pounded, his body aching from hours of standing, but he couldn't falter. Mwendaji's breaths were ragged, his eyes half closed. The water Tembo had given him earlier no match for the storm's fury. The lion's wounds, exposed to the rain, looked raw, and Tembo's stomach twisted with fear. What if they'd stayed for nothing? What if kindness couldn't outlast the wild? He glanced at Kipepeo, her massive frame swaying, her breaths heavy. She was old, older than he'd realized, and the storm was testing her too. "Hold fast," Kipepeo rumbled, her voice strained but fierce. The herd pressed tighter, their trunks linking, their calves tucked beneath trembling flanks. Tembo leaned into the wind, his ears flattened, his eyes stinging from rain. Mud sucked at his feet, each step a battle, but he moved closer to Mwendaji, shielding the lion's head with his trunk. The lion stirred, a low groan escaping him, and Tembo's chest tightened. He was still fighting, still here, and that was enough to keep Tembo rooted. Lightning flashed again, revealing Kipepeo's faltering stance. Her legs buckled slightly, her trunk drooping as she braced against a gust. Tembo's heart lurched. She was the herd's strength, their guide, but the storm was merciless. "Kipepeo," he called, his voice swallowed by the roar. She met his eyes, her gaze warm but weary, and nodded, as if passing him a weight he wasn't sure he could carry. Tembo's breath hitched. He couldn't let her fall, couldn't let Mwendaji slip away. He trumpeted, sharp and clear, cutting through the storm. "Together!" he cried, his voice raw but steady. The herd rumbled in response, their bodies shifting to form a tighter wall around Mwendaji. Tembo took the lead, his trunk guiding a younger cow to block the wind, his shoulder pressing against Kipepeo's to steady her. She leaned into him, her warmth a quiet thank you, and Tembo felt a surge of strength, not just his own, but the herd's, woven through their shared resolve. Mwendaji stirred again, his head lifting, his eyes catching Tembo's in a flash of lightning. The lion's gaze was clearer now, burning with something fierce. Gratitude, defiance, life. He struggled, his paws slipping in the mud, trying to stand. Tembo's heart leapt, a spark of hope igniting. "Keep going," he whispered, his trunk brushing Mwendaji's flank, urging him on. The lion's effort was small, shaky, but it was enough to fuel Tembo's resolve, to make the storm feel conquerable. The rain pounded harder, the wind screaming, but the herd held firm, their rumbles a low, steady pulse against the chaos. Tembo's legs burned, his body shivering, but he stood tall, his eyes darting between Mwendaji and Kipepeo. He saw Nia in the distance, her form blurred by rain, watching but still apart. The ache of her absence was sharp, but Tembo pushed it down, focusing on the lion, on the herd, on the moment. As the storm raged, Tembo felt the weight of their choice. Kindness wasn't just water or trust, it was this, standing through the worst, together. Mwendaji's head rested again, his breath stronger, and Kipepeo's trunk brushed Tembo's, a gesture of pride. The savannah roared around them, but within their circle there was a fragile warmth, a promise that their sacrifice mattered. Dawn was hours away, and the storm showed no mercy, but Tembo stood firm, his heart alight with the belief that they could carry Mwendaji through, that kindness could endure even this. Midday sun bathed the savannah, its warmth softening the mud left by the storm. The air hummed with life, crickets chirping, a distant zebra's bray, but a heavy quiet hung over the herd. Tembo stood by Mwendaji, his trunk curled, his heart tight with a truth he couldn't ignore. The lion's breaths were shallow now, his eyes dim, the spark that had flared during the storm fading. The pride's leader, the young lioness named Asali lay nearby, her gaze soft but resolute, as if she too felt the end coming. Kipepeo stood tall, her tusks catching the light, her silence a steady anchor for the herd. Tembo's eyes traced Mwendaji's scars, each one a story of battles fought, lives spared, water saved. The lion's flank barely moved, his tongue still, his wounds too deep for water or trust to heal. Tembo's chest ached, a raw, twisting pain. He'd given water, faced hyenas, stood through the storm, but it wasn't enough. He glanced at Kipepeo, hoping for a miracle, but her eyes were sad, her trunk hovering near Mwendaji as if memorizing him. Asali rose, her tail low, and approached Mwendaji. She nuzzled his face, a low, mournful rumble in her throat. Mwendaji's eyes opened, bright for a moment, meeting hers with a flicker of recognition. Tembo's throat tightened. He wanted to look away, to escape the weight of this moment, but he couldn't. Mwendaji's gaze shifted, finding Tembo, and the lion's head lifted slightly, a weak but deliberate movement. He nudged Tembo's trunk, his muzzle warm and rough, a gesture so gentle it broke something inside the young elephant. Tembo's eyes stung, his trunk curling around Mwendaji's head, holding him close. "You fought hard," he whispered, his voice thick, the words meant for them alone. Mwendaji's rumble was faint, almost a sigh, as if saying goodbye. Tembo felt Kipepeo's trunk on his shoulder, her warmth steadying him, but the pain was his own, sharp and deep. He'd known Mwendaji only days, yet the thread between them, woven through water, courage, and trust, felt like a lifetime. The herd's rumbles grew soft, a low, grieving chorus. Kipepeo stepped closer, her trunk brushing Mwendaji's flank, her eyes glistening. "You gave us more than we could repay," she murmured, her voice heavy with gratitude. The other elephants joined, their trunks raised, their rumbles vibrating through the earth. Asali and the lionesses watched, their heads low, their silence a shared mourning. Tembo felt Nia's presence, closer now, her trunk grazing his back, her warmth a quiet apology for the distance between them. Mwendaji's eyes closed, his breaths slowing, each one softer than the last. Tembo held his breath, willing the lion to stay, but the savannah seemed to still, the air heavy with finality. With a final, gentle sigh, Mwendaji's flank stilled, his body easing into the earth. Tembo's heart shattered, a sob escaping as he pressed his trunk to Mwendaji's face, memorizing the feel of him. The herd trumpeted, a raw, piercing sound that echoed across the savannah, joined by the pride's roars, deep and mournful, a tribute to their fallen king. Tembo stepped back, his legs trembling, his eyes blurred with tears. Kipepeo's trunk curled around him, her warmth a lifeline. "He knew," she said softly. "He felt our love." Tembo nodded, unable to speak, his gaze on Mwendaji's still form, now peaceful, free of pain. Asali approached, her eyes meeting. Tembo's, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, gratitude, respect, a shared loss. The savannah shimmered, the sun bright on Mwendaji's fur, as if honoring him. Tembo felt the herd's unity, their grief binding them tighter than fear ever could. Nia stood closer now, her trunk lingering on his, and Tembo leaned into her, grateful for her return. The pain of Mwendaji's loss was unbearable, yet it carried a strange beauty. Their kindness had given him peace, a farewell surrounded by those who cared. As the herd and pride stood together, Tembo felt Mwendaji's spirit in the breeze, a reminder that their bond, though brief, would endure, etched into the savannah's heart. Days later, the savannah thrummed with life, its colors vivid under a cloudless sky. The mud from the storm had dried, leaving the grass crisp and golden, swaying in a gentle breeze. Tembo walked with the herd, his steps lighter, though his heart still carried the weight of Mwendaji's loss. The acacia stood behind them, a silent marker of their farewell, but the herd moved forward, their rumbles warm, their trunks brushing one another in quiet unity. Kipapeo led, her tusks catching the sunlight, her strength restored. Nia walked beside Tembo, her trunk grazing his, their bond mended, stronger for the pain they'd shared. Tembo's eyes wandered to the horizon, where the watering hole gleamed, its surface rippling under the sun. As the herd approached, he noticed something new. Asali and her pride patrolled its edges, their movements deliberate, their eyes scanning for threats. Tembo's ears flared, a spark of recognition igniting. They were guarding it, just as Mwindaji had years ago, keeping poachers and hyenas at bay. His chest swelled with quiet awe, and Mwindaji's legacy lived on, carried by those he'd loved. The herd drank, their trunks splashing playfully, the calves squealing as they sprayed each other. Tembo watched, his heart lifting at the sight. But it wasn't just the pride. The savanna itself seemed different, softer. A herd of zebras grazed nearby, closer than usual, their ears flicking but their bodies relaxed, sharing space with antelope, who didn't bolt at their approach. Overhead, a flock of oxpeckers chirped, darting between the herd and the zebras, their warning sharper, more urgent when a hawk circled too close. Tembo's trunk curled, a slow realization dawning. Their kindness to Mwindaji had rippled outward, touching creatures they'd never know. Kipapeo paused by the water, her eyes meeting Tembo's, a knowing glint in them. "You see it. Don't." "You?" she said, her voice warm. Tembo nodded, his throat tight. "It's because of him," he said, his voice soft but sure. "Because we stayed." Kipapeo's trunk brushed his shoulder, her rumble one of pride. "Because you acted," she corrected, and Tembo's heart thudded, the weight of her words settling deep. He turned to the calves, their wide eyes curious as they nudged his legs. One, a bold female named Lila, tugged at his trunk, her voice high and eager. "Tell us about the lion," she demanded, her ears flapping. Tembo hesitated, the pain of Mwindaji's loss still raw, but Lila's excitement pulled him forward. He knelt, the herd gathering around, even Nia's eyes softening as she listened. "His name was Mwindaji," Tembo began, his voice steady. "He was brave, and he spared lives, even ours." The calves leaned in, their rumbles hushed as Tembo recounted the water, the hyenas, the storm, and Mwindaji's final nuzzle. He spoke of kindness, how it was hard, risky, but worth it, how it changed the savanna. Lila's eyes shone, her trunk waving. "I'll be kind like that," she declared, and Tembo's heart lifted, a smile curling his trunk. He saw Nia nod, her gaze warm, and knew she felt it too. Their story wasn't just theirs anymore. The zebras moved closer, their foals, mingling with the elephant calves, a sight Tembo had never seen. An antelope paused, its head low, as if offering thanks before drinking. The oxpeckers chirped louder, their wings brushing Tembo's ears, and he felt Mwindaji in every act, every shared moment. The savanna was alive with it. Small kindnesses, unspoken trusts, a web woven from their choice to stay. As the herd moved on, Tembo lingered, his eyes on the watering hole, where Asali's pride stood watch. He trumpeted softly, a tribute to Mwindaji, and the lioness's ears flicked, her gaze meeting his across the distance. The savanna carried the sound, its breeze warm, as if whispering back. Tembo turned to follow the herd, his heart full, knowing. Their kindness had sparked something enduring, a light that would guide the wild long after they were gone. The savanna glowed under a golden sunset, the sky ablaze with hues of amber and rose, as if honoring the day's quiet beauty. Tembo walked. With the herd, his steps sure, his heart a tapestry of grief and hope. The acacia, the watering hole, Mwindaji's final resting place, all lay behind them, but their presence lingered in Tembo's chest, a steady warmth. Kipapeo led, her tusks catching the fading light, her rumbles soft and guiding. Nia walked. Beside Tembo, her trunk brushing his, their bond a silent promise, rebuilt through shared loss and love. The herd moved as one, their calves weaving between legs, their trunks swaying in playful arcs. Tembo watched Lila, the bold calf, mimic his trumpets, her eyes bright with the story he'd shared. The savannah hummed around them, zebras grazing peacefully, oxpeckers darting overhead, the air alive with the small kindnesses Mwindaji's legacy had sparked. Tembo's ears flared, catching the distant roar of Asali's pride, a reminder of the balance they'd forged, fragile but enduring. He slowed, his gaze settling on Kipapeo, her wrinkled face serene yet heavy with years. She paused, sensing his need, and turned to him, her eyes warm, inviting. "You're quiet," she said, her voice a low rumble, like the earth itself speaking. Tembo's trunk curled, his throat tight with words he'd held since Mwindaji's. "Farewell." "I keep thinking about him," he said, his voice soft but clear. "About what he taught us. What you taught me." Kipapeo's trunk brushed his, a gesture of pride and patience. "And what's that?" she asked, though her eyes suggested she knew. Tembo took a breath, the savannah's breeze cool against his skin. "Kindness isn't just giving water or standing through a storm. It's choosing to care, even when it's hard, even when it hurts. Mwindaji spared your calf, saved our water, and we gave him peace." His voice wavered, but he pressed on. "I want to be like that. Always." Kipapeo's rumble was deep, almost a laugh, her eyes glinting with approval. "You already are," she said, her trunk resting on his shoulder, heavy with trust. Tembo's chest swelled, but doubt lingered. "It's not easy," he admitted. Nia was so scared, and the herd split. What if kindness cost too much? Kipapeo's gaze softened, her tusks gleaming as she tilted her head. "It always does," she said. "But it's worth it. Look around you." Tembo did, seeing the herd's unity, the calves' fearless play, the zebras sharing space with antelope in the distance. He felt a Mwindaji in the breeze, in the pride's distant roars, in Lila's eager trumpets. Kindness had cost them, fear, division, loss, but it had given them more, trust, hope, a savannah alive with connection. Tembo nodded, his heart settling. "I'll keep trying," he said, his voice firm. "For Mwindaji, for all of us." The herd gathered closer, their rumbles a warm chorus as if sealing his vow. Nia's trunk curled around his, her eyes bright with pride, and Tembo leaned into her, grateful for her love. As they moved toward the horizon, the savannah stretched. Before them, vibrant and vast, a canvas for the kindness they'd carry forward. Tembo felt Mwindaji's spirit in the wind, a gentle nudge, urging him on. He trumpeted softly, the sound carrying his promise, and the herd answered, their voices rising into the twilight. The sunset faded, stars piercing the sky, and Tembo walked. With purpose, his heart alight with the truth that kindness could change everything. One act, one life, one savannah at a time. Inspired by Tembo's journey, let kindness guide your actions today. Share a small act of compassion. Help a stranger, listen to a friend, or protect something vulnerable in your world. Like Tembo, let your choices ripple outward, creating a legacy of hope. Start now and see the change you can make.